asked a lot of my gouache students from my online courses as well as my Instagram audience and my email subscribers about what their biggest challenges have been with gouache. What is the thing they struggle with the most and what gets them stuck when they're painting with gouache. There was a number one reply that came out amongst all of the replies, which was consistency. So many people told me that they struggle to get the consistency right. Their paint either ends up too thick or too watery, and they don't know how to use the different opacities of gouache. So in today's video, we're going through a simple tea to butter method to understand gouache consistency so that you no longer have to struggle with that issue. Let's dive straight into it. Okay, so like I said, this is the tea to butter method to understand consistency. I like using this method because it becomes very easy to visualize what the consistency is that you're going for. We're going to try out all of these consistencies and then we're going to discuss their applications as well. For this, I'm using Canson Montval paper, which is this one, which I think is a great gouache paper for beginners to use. I have some Winsor & Newton Designers Gouache. The color I'm using is Spectrum Red. So I'm going to freshly squeeze some out onto my palette as well. I've got a jar of water here and I've got a Princeton flat brush to use for the demonstration. So first, for the butter consistency, what I'm going to do is dip a damp brush into my paint. So I'm removing all the excess moisture. I've washed my brush off, so it's slightly damp, but I'm going to wipe off all of the extra moisture. I just want it to be damp, not wet. So when you touch the brush, there shouldn't be any water coming off on your hand, but at the same time, it should feel a little damp. Otherwise, it's going to be very tough to spread your paint. So I'm going to dip it straight into this paint, which is fresh from the tube. Coat my bristles well. And I'm going to start by swatching that in this butter section. So you can very clearly see how thick the paint is, how hard it is to spread, and how it kind of looks like butter would look if you were to spread it on paper. It has these dry brush strokes that are forming, and that is typical of butter consistency. You would use this consistency if you're trying to intentionally accomplish a kind of dry brushing effect. So now let's try adding a little water to the paint and see what happens. I'm dipping just the tip of my brush into the water, trying to not bring in too much extra moisture. And I'm going to thin the paint down just a little bit. The paint should now feel really easy to spread on the palette, but at the same time it should be really opaque. You shouldn't be able to see the base of your palette. A good way to think of it is like melted ice cream, which is why we're calling it the cream consistency. So once you feel you've accomplished that, where it's easy to move on your palette and the paint doesn't feel too thick, but at the same time doesn't feel so watery, then you can go ahead and paint that as your cream consistency. Like you can see, there's a huge difference between these two consistencies. Here it was so much easier for me to spread the paint on the paper just by adding that little extra moisture into the paint. This is the perfect gouache consistency that artists are usually trying to accomplish when they want nice, smooth and matte, creamy gouache layers. Unless you bring it to this nice consistency, you're not going to be able to layer your paint easily. And maybe layering is something we can discuss in detail in a future video. Let me know in the comments if that's something you'd be interested in. But for now, let's look at the milk consistency. So again, I'm dipping a little bit of my brush into water, not too much. I'll put it on the side so that I don't accidentally bring in too much water into my paint. And I'll make that much thinner than it was in the previous swatch. So now you will notice that you will be able to see the base of your palette through the paint. It's not as thick and creamy as it felt in the previous swatch. And then you can go ahead and paint it. If you feel like there's not too much difference between these two, just water it down a little bit more. What you're going to find is that it's going to be quite thick and quite opaque, but at the same time it's not going to be as opaque as your cream consistency. You'll see that there's possibly a bit of patchiness as the paint dries, and in parts you might be able to see the white of the paper through it. Now, while you're just painting a simple swatch like this, it may not look too different from the cream like I said, but when you actually bring this into artwork, you'll see a huge difference in the way this behaves. If your paint is this watery, you're not going to be able to layer it well, and you're not going to get a nice smooth application of paint. This is where most gouache artists really struggle. There are very subtle differences in these consistencies, but if you practice it and if you try to accomplish this consistency, you're going to see your artwork improve a lot. So now let's look at the coffee consistency. And this milk consistency is really undesirable. It's not something that artists usually want because it's kind of neither here nor there. It's neither thin enough, like we're going to discuss in coffee and tea, and at the same time it's not thick enough for you to get that nice gouache appeal. So now I've watered down the paint again a lot more. And here you can start seeing a lot more a lot more transparency. You're able to see the white of the paper through it. It's starting to behave somewhat like watercolor. Now this is where it gets interesting, and this is where you really see the versatility of gouache, because in these consistencies like coffee and the next one we're going to do, which is tea, you can really use the paint as background washes, you can use it as glazes and do really interesting things with it. You can choose to use gouache in this nice thin consistency for certain applications. But like I said, this milk consistency is sort of neither here nor there. You would usually want to use it like this when you're painting, and these two can have some potential applications. So for the tea, go all out with the water. Water it down as much as you want to. There's no issue. Just water down the paint a lot just to see what happens. So my brush is right now mostly loaded up with water and hardly any pigment. And I'm going to paint that, and like you see, this is so much thinner, but at the same time, like when you compare it to a medium like watercolor, this is still so much more vibrant, and that's just because that's the nature of gouache. That's why I always say that while you can water down gouache and use it like watercolor, it's best not to think of gouache exactly like watercolor, because it doesn't behave exactly the same way. It has its own unique techniques to be used and unique ways to use it. You're not going to get blooms and things like that the way you would with watercolor. So don't think of gouache as watercolor. Rather think of it as its own medium, a really unique medium that can be used in really interesting ways. So that's our tea to butter method to understand consistency, and I hope this made it a lot more easy for you to understand the right consistency that you should be after when you're working with gouache. I would recommend that you practice this multiple times so that you get used to bringing gouache to this creamy consistency. The biggest mistake people make is that they tend to water the paint down too much, and then they end up with something like this when they're after something like this. So just keep practicing and you'll definitely get better at it. For now, if you have any further questions about this or anything else to do with gouache, please drop them in the comments below. If you're interested in improving your skills further as a gouache artist, I'm so excited to let you know that I've launched the Joy to Gouache Academy, which is the home to all of my gouache courses. I teach you things like gouache for beginners, where I'll take you through all the tips, techniques and tools that you need to get started. I have a class on loose landscapes, one on gouache florals, and one on color mixing at the moment, and there are going to be a lot more classes coming out there in the future. Be sure to click the link in my description to check out the Joy of Gouache, and you can sign up for any of my online courses there. I'll see you next week. Thank you once again. Bye.